They give us an update on what's going on in the wild and what they're finding. So with that, I will let Dr. Iga Stasiak give a presentation on behalf of the Saskatchewan Department of the Environment.
Thank you, Harvey. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this morning. I haven't had an opportunity to speak to this group in the past, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm a wildlife veterinarian with the Ministry of Environment. Just started last May. In Saskatchewan for about a year. Previously, I worked as a wildlife veterinarian down in Kentucky for the last 4 years, and in the Northwest Territories for a year as well. So since I moved here, chronic wasting disease has really been the major topic that I've been focused on. It's a real challenge here from a wildlife perspective. It's been around for about 20 years now, but it's continuing to be a growing concern here in the province. So why is this disease so challenging? You're all familiar with the background, the basics. I'm not going to go into that. Most of us, when you think of an animal with CWD, you might think of an animal that's emaciated, droopy ears, salivating. That's not what most of the animals on the landscape look like, as you know. We know this disease has a long incubation period, average of 2 years in deer, 3 years in elk. So most of the animals on the landscape look like this, and that's what most of the hunter-harvested animals look like that test CWD positive. And in that time, during that incubation period, before those animals succumb to infection, they are shedding infectious prions into the environment, which makes this disease really, really challenging to deal with. So over the years, we have watched this disease progress across the province. We started out in a few core areas. High infection rates along the South Saskatchewan River Valley, Lloydminster area where it was first detected in 2000 in wild mule deer, and we had detections in the early 2000s in the Love Nipawin area. Which brings us to last season. So this is the latest map from last hunting season. Since 1997, we've had a hunter CWD surveillance program, so hunters have dropped off heads for CWD testing. This isn't the reality on the landscape today. These are all the CWD positive detections in wildlife. It is now present in 48 of our 86 wildlife management zones. All the new detections just this past year are highlighted in red. Just last year, we've identified it in 9 new wildlife management zones in Saskatchewan, including parts of south central and eastern Saskatchewan where the disease has not previously been detected. We had a total of 349 positives, which is comparable to the total number of positives we've seen in the last 20 years. Slightly lower than that, but over 2,000 samples collected. So we are seeing expansion of the disease across the landscape. And some of these new detections are attributed to the fact that we had an increased number of submission in those areas where we haven't done a whole lot of sampling in the past. So as a proxy for prevalence, these aren't actual prevalence estimates. These are the proportion of positive animals that tested positive just this past year. You can see 50% mule deer along the South Saskatchewan River Valley, about 30% of our white-tailed deer. Similar prevalence estimates in the Lloydminster area, slightly lower prevalence estimates in the Love Nipawin area where we've seen it in our white-tailed deer and elk populations. Also, should mention we also had 2 moose that tested positive this year, which were only the second and third moose that ever tested positive here in Saskatchewan. We also had more moose submitted this year than we have in previous years. So back in 2008, so about 8 years after we detected in the wild, our prevalence estimates in our core areas were around 3%. We've seen a really exponential increase in prevalence across the province, now up to around 40% in some of our core areas. So we talked a little bit about transmission. So we know there are 2 main routes of transmission, and that's direct and indirect. So direct transmission is that animal-to-animal contact. So that could be social grooming, so contact with infected bodily fluids when animals are in contact, and that could be social behaviors or fence line contact between captive and wild cervids. And also indirect contact, so that's our environmental sources, contamination from contaminated feed, water, soil sources. We know early in the course of infection when a disease is first introduced, that direct route is quite important. So that animal-to-animal contact, as the disease becomes established on the landscape, the indirect sources or the environmental sources become a more important factor, likely driving transmission. We know that when we congregate animals, we increase risk of disease transmission. So we have a lot of concerns, and here in Saskatchewan, there's a lot of potential sources of animal aggregation or concentration. Baiting and feeding is still a legal practice here in the province. We also have a lot of attractants on the landscape. We have a very strong farming culture, and so there's a lot of various types of attractants that could attract wildlife, especially in the winter months. So we know those pose a risk of disease transmission. So we know environmental contamination plays an important role. As was demonstrated in some of the earlier presentations, it's really challenging to test for prions in the environment. We don't have a reliable field test available. That's one of the other challenges. It's not easy to test for prions. But there have been a number of research studies that have identified prions in a number of water sources or environmental sources. And that include water sources in endemic areas of Colorado, mineral lakes that were frequented by deer in southern parts of Wisconsin, where the area is endemic for chronic wasting disease. And there's also been a number of research studies looking at prion infectivity in different types of soil, and I'm glad to see there'll be a presentation on that later today as well. But we know that clay soils increase infectivity or bind prions, and there's been a number of studies that have shown increased infection rates in areas where there are clay soils, and increased infectivity associated with that. There's also been a number of studies looking at plants. There was a study in 2015 that looked at the possibilities of uptake of wheatgrass, or prion uptake by wheatgrass. So what the researchers did here is they incubated the stems and leaves of these plants with infectious urine and feces from infected cervids, and they found that the prions were taken up by the leaves and stems. And they also repeated the experiment with, I believe, brain homogenate material from infected hamsters, and they grew the plants in that, and they were taken up by the roots as well. So we know that species barrier is likely robust. There is a strong species barrier, but it does raise questions regarding potential exposure of other species in the environment. So here in Saskatchewan, we have a lot of unique challenges. So soon after I moved here, I found this article in the paper. This is a camera trap photo near the North Battleford area of a wild boar. So we have invasive wild boar here in the province. And recently, there's been one research study that looked at the potential for transmission of CWD to domestic swine. And what they did is they orally inoculated swine with infectious material, CWD infected material. And over 50% of the pigs actually accumulated prions in their lymph nodes and brain tissue, showing that pigs do have a potential to bioaccumulate prions. Now, we don't know if they can transmit them in the environment. That hasn't really been looked at yet, but it does raise some concerns. So this was an article I came across in a Saskatchewan paper. So wild boar causing trouble on the farm. So this was a farmer that had reported some wild boar on his property. They were feeding near his deer blind, and they reported the feral swine were licking minerals at the deer blind, and were repeatedly visiting the area. So this does raise some questions in terms of potential for wild boar to serve as reservoirs of CWD in areas where there is aggregation or concentration of prions, either relating to artificial feeding or contact with carcasses themselves. So why are we, as a wildlife agency, why are we so concerned about this disease? We now have, there's been peer-reviewed studies in 3 of our major ungulate species showing the significant population level impacts of chronic wasting disease. And these studies are out of Colorado and Wyoming, where the disease has been established for over 30 years. So this particular study of white-tailed deer out of an endemic area of Wyoming, where the disease has been present since the early 70s. They have very high prevalence rates in this population of over 42% in does and 29% in bucks. So these deer were collared, they were monitored over time, and what they found was that the CWD positive deer were 4.5 times as likely to die annually than CWD negative deer, and they demonstrated a 10.4% annual decline in the population. And so what these researchers concluded was that not only did CWD have the potential to be population limiting, the results suggest that these populations are not sustainable at current harvest levels. Similar results have been found in mule deer and elk populations, both in Colorado and Wyoming. In mule deer populations, they found an even more significant annual decline. In the core area, in the same endemic area, they have a 50% population decline, some of that attributed to winter kills. We certainly have our share of harsh winters here in Saskatchewan as well, which kind of makes it sometimes very difficult to decipher the role of weather or winter mortality relative to mortality associated with CWD. So what do we know, what kind of data do we have here in Saskatchewan? So this is information courtesy of Dr. Trent Wollinger at the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. He's done a lot of work down in the South Saskatchewan River area. And some of his recent research has focused on survival analysis. So he collared some does along the South Saskatchewan River valleys. These are mule deer does. And this was back last February. And monitored those does over time. So by 8 months, you can see in blue, we have does, the survival rate of does in that area, and it's above 80%. But when you look at the CWD positive deer, by about 8 months after they were biopsied and collared, we have 55% survival. So significantly decreased survival in CWD positive animals. And in this core area, so he looked at 2 particular study areas, the CWD prevalence is estimated at 39% and 46%, which is extremely high in this population. And if you compare this to survival rates around 2008, about 10 years ago, they were closer to 80%, which is normal survival rate. So there are other species that we haven't really had a chance to talk about in the past, and I think it's important that we do focus some attention on these as well. And that includes caribou. So we have both barren ground and boreal caribou populations here in the province. And caribou are an iconic species across the north. First Nations have relied on caribou populations for thousands of years as a form of sustenance, food, and clothing. Caribou are in decline across the Arctic. So Canada's certainly not unique to this. But specifically here in Canada and the Northwest Territories, majority of our barren ground caribou herds are in decline. And there's a number of different factors attributed to this. But previously, we haven't had any CWD detections in caribou. We also haven't done a lot of surveillance in this particular species. What do we know about susceptibility of caribou to CWD? That's mainly based on experimental trials in reindeer. So there's been 2 studies, one by CFIA and one done by the USDA in the US, that where there were experimental infections done on reindeer, and they were able to show transmission, and the animals did develop clinical disease and showed similar progression of disease as deer here in endemic areas of Saskatchewan. So up until recently, there'd never been any detection of CWD in free-ranging caribou or reindeer. And that changed in March of 2016 when CWD was detected in wild reindeer in Norway. So this was in the high alpine region of Norway, circled here in red. Fairly isolated population of just over 2,000 animals. And in this case, the government took a very drastic approach. So they decided they were going to call the entire herd of reindeer. The total population there is approximately 25,000. So they were going to call about 10% of the population, total population, to try to eradicate the disease and leave the area with the idea that they would leave the area fallow for 5 years before allowing introduction of wild animals. This is certainly not something that would ever be an option here in Canada or in Saskatchewan. They had the unique opportunity that they thought it was a relatively early detection. It was an isolated population. Here in Canada, we have very widespread, wide-ranging caribou populations. So boreal caribou are a threatened species. So they're listed as threatened under the Species at Risk Act, which means that we have legal obligations to protect the species. The biggest threat is clearly habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. But because they're so vulnerable, they're susceptible to a variety of different elements. So if you look at this map here, I think it really speaks for itself. You can see the caribou range in yellow to the north. And you can see in red, these are rural municipalities where CWD has been detected. And it really is right adjacent or abut to the caribou range. And if we zoom in more closely, so this is the Love Nipawin area, which many of you are familiar with. This is an area where we've traditionally had a fairly high rate of CWD in our wild populations. And you can see the proximity of a CWD positive detections to the caribou range and historic locations of caribou in this region. One of the questions that comes up that was addressed by some of our speakers earlier this morning, that's a really big topic with our hunting community, and a lot of people are asking a lot of questions about this right now, is whether or not CWD is transmissible to humans. So as you know, we believe the risk is likely very remote and very low. There's been no documented cases of CWD in humans. And there's been a number of studies in non-human primates with variable results. So there's been a lot of attention paid to the macaque studies. So there was one by the NIH, which was a 13-year study where they were not able to demonstrate transmission to macaque monkeys, and another study by the Alberta Prion Institute where they were able to demonstrate transmission. So there's still, quite a variation in terms of the evolutionary tree. We're talking millions of years, so we're not very closely related to macaque monkeys, but this has raised the profile of the disease and concerns regarding potential for transmission, especially given there's a lot we don't know about prion diseases and their incubation. So the recommendation by Health Canada and the World Health Organization has been for hunters to not consume animals that are known to be infected. And this is really just out of an abundance of caution, in keeping with a precautionary approach. But perhaps more importantly than the risk itself is the perception of the risk. And this is what we're dealing with right now. So this is an article just came out last month. So one of the food banks here in Saskatchewan is turning away wild game donations over disease concerns. So this is now having implications on local communities, on our Indigenous communities, underprivileged communities that are relying on these food banks for sustenance. And even knowing that the disease risk is likely very remote, and there's been no human cases, the perception is sometimes even more important. And so this has impacted us as well. So what are the main threats of CWD spread as it pertains to wildlife? So certainly artificial concentration, so mating and feeding practices and practices that congregate wildlife, creating disease hotspots. When we not only have increased concentrations of animals, we have increased shedding of urine, feces, and saliva, environmental contamination. The expansion of deer, so we've had northward expansion of deer populations up into the boreal forest, which has implications, of course, for spillover into caribou populations. Carcass movement, which I'll talk about a little bit more shortly. We have hunters that are moving carcasses across the province, and many of those could be infected. And of course, the infection in the game farms is also a concern. So as far as carcass movement, this is just a map showing the postal codes of all the hunters that were drawn in the areas shown in orange. So these are mule deer draw areas. And you can see that they are widespread across the province. So these hunters, they might be field dressing their animal in the field, they might be taking that carcass back with them, processing it or taking it to a processor. And then what happens to that carcass after it's been butchered or processed? The problem is disposal. We don't really know. Some of it ending up on the landscape, and so some of it, could be out on the back 40. So that is certainly a concern. So as wildlife managers, what can we do at this point? You saw the map, you saw how widespread the disease is and how endemic it is in parts of the province here. So what we can do is we can manage the disease in areas where we know it's been detected, so our endemic areas. And we can try to keep the remainder of the province CWD free, and many of us can argue that there's not very many areas of the province that are CWD free. So what we're really trying to work towards is to shift towards management. So we've been doing surveillance, and you can argue we really do need enhanced surveillance in certain areas, but we really want to shift now towards management. And what can we do? Well, the things we can do is we can try to minimize transmission. So minimize sources of transmission in the environment. That's the most significant thing we can do at this point. We're not going to eradicate the disease. So how are we going to do that? We're going to focus on artificial points of concentration to address issues such as baiting and feeding and various agricultural practices that may contribute to congregation of wildlife. We're trying to at least minimize that risk and those opportunities for animals to congregate. Restricting carcass movement is something that we need to look at. Carcass disposal is perhaps a more important piece, so not just moving the carcass, but where does it end up when we're finished with it. It's an important element. Harvest management, so we might be looking at adaptive management strategies in certain areas, but this time doing it in a strategic long-term approach where we actually have measurable outcomes, and we look at maybe more of a 10 and 20-year plan in terms of increasing harvest, we're trying to reduce densities of deer in certain areas where they're high, or targeting bucks or older segments of the population that are more likely to be infected. We want to work closely with your industry, with the Ministry of Agriculture, to address concerns within the game farming industry, looking at things like enforcement and consideration for things that maybe we haven't really thought about. Looking at high-risk areas or areas of high sensitivity, such as the caribou range, or areas that are highly endemic. Asking ourselves really challenging questions. Should we be issuing new licenses in areas, for instance, that we know are highly endemic, such as the Love Nipawin area? And as I mentioned, using an adaptive management approach. So really having a plan, having targeted areas where we're actually doing something and having measurable outcomes over time. So we can see if our management strategies are actually working, which is going to include surveillance and include population monitoring in those areas. So what if we do nothing? So that's always an option on the table. It's an option we've always had on the table. We could just sit back and watch as this disease continues to spread across the province as it has over the last 20 years. Well, likely we are going to see population decline. So we definitely have data showing decreased survival. We do have more clinical cases reported to us by members of the public. We haven't documented population decline, but that's largely because we haven't had comparative population studies to show that decline over time. We expect that likely in the next few years we are going to be able to document that. We do expect a change in age-sex structure, so loss of those segment that's more likely to be infected, so loss of older age classes and trophy bucks. And that might affect hunting participation, tourism, might impact our outfitting industry as well. And if things continue the way they are, we are likely going to see spillover into boreal species, into the boreal ecosystem. It's possible the disease is there yet and hasn't been detected, but until we do find it, I think we do need to try to do what we can to prevent that. We likely will see impaired food security for First Nations, especially if we see any impacts on, with population decline, potential impacts on deer, moose, caribou populations that communities rely on and hunters rely on. And like I talked about, the perception of the disease itself, There might be a loss of confidence, whether or not justified or not. There might be a loss of confidence in the food supply, which we're seeing already and is a big concern. So where do we go from here? And what do we need? Well, we need to work together. And I think that's always a challenge. We tend to work in our silos, and it's sometimes difficult to branch across ministries or across organizations, different stakeholder groups. But I think that's really where we need to go. Otherwise, we're not going to be effective. So we need to look at some of these control strategies to see if we can reach a common ground and implement them effectively. And I think by working together, hopefully we can get there. And I just wanted to end with this slide here. This is, I'd say one of my goals is an environment that will sustain present and future generations. I have a picture caribou here because I used to work in the Northwest Territories, and so this is a picture provided by one of our biologists, caribou biologist, Bruno Croft. And to me, it has a lot of meaning. And I think that all of you are very passionate about what you do. All of us have some sort of objective or something that drives us. And for you, that could be, you could insert a picture of a white-tailed deer buck or an elk here, whether it's ranching or game farming or whatever it is that drives us. I think, communication is a start, and hopefully we can try to work towards a common goal. So thank you.
I just wanted to say that I enjoyed your presentation. I appreciate you bringing in the concern about carcass disposal. It's something, from working in a biosecurity field for a little while, it's something that's always concerned me, the idea of, I know that deer farmers and elk farmers can be part of the issue, but I think that moving carcasses, wild carcasses, is also part of the issue. I mean, it's a biosecurity tenet, right? And so I'm glad that you addressed that, and I think that needs to be higher on the list of things to look at.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I think that we need to acknowledge that there's definitely things we need to do on the wildlife side. We need to work together, but yeah, disposal is a major issue that we're going to be looking at in the next year because we don't really have the infrastructure right now to deal with that.
Late.
Hi. We've talked on the phone.
Yes.
You're obviously very new at this, and I appreciate your outlook.
I don't know how to take that.
We have been completely or totally, in my opinion, ignored by environment for most of the time, and vilified. And had an attitude such of yours been brought forward earlier, we wouldn't be in this position. The failed policies of both CFIA and Sask Environment and their handling of it once it was loose in the wild is the reason we have it throughout the province, period. Game farms did contribute, but we're still pointing at game farms. There isn't enough of us left to be a source of new infections. Okay.
Well,
just a few questions on your stats. Did you receive samples from all the zones?
I have to look specifically, but I don't believe we did. But I know specifically in certain zones we only received, a handful of samples. So there's certainly zones where the sampling was quite low. We were way up in submissions this year because of the drive that was put on. We were 2,000 as opposed to the typical 500 or 600, and found 300 positives or thereabouts. If we had 8,000 submissions like Alberta, what if we found 1,200 positives? It's possible. Yeah, and depends obviously where the submissions are coming
Right.
from. Most of them are still coming from our core areas.
Right.
So most hunters, and I think, perhaps it has to do with education. There hasn't been a lot of samples submitted outside of those core areas in the past. But yeah, I expect, the more we look, we're going to find more cases.
Thanks.
So I have a question and a comment. First of all, a comment for anybody here that might be in that right category and who's listening. In terms of things that need to be done, I think an investment in basic research, just the basic research of these diseases and the agents causing these diseases is a major component. Both here in Canada and North America and generally. You know, I get asked questions a lot about what we know about prion diseases, and the most frequent answer I find myself coming up with is, we don't know. So my question is, how accurate do you think these estimates of incidence are? And that speaks also to what kind of surveillance is really going on here and how accurate those surveillance mechanisms are.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in some cases, they're not very reliable because of the sample sizes, right, in some of these areas. So it really ranges. We have done some prevalence estimates looking at confidence intervals, and in some areas, such as the Love Nipawin area, the confidence intervals are quite wide. So the estimates of prevalence could be anywhere between 10% and 40%. So quite a range. So we certainly don't have adequate surveillance in those areas. We're also working with a very limited budget. So in the future, we're likely going to be looking at more targeted surveillance, where we might rotate on a yearly basis and focus on specific areas so we can try to get a better sample size in a core area, maybe come back to that area every 3 to 4 years. And it really does come down to the budget. There hasn't been enough budget for surveillance or research for that matter. And so we are really struggling, I'd say, as an agency to try to get a handle on that.
Take one more question, Ian.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, and I agree with Blaine. I love your hopeful attitude, and carry on. And that feeds into a question about social license. And one of your predecessors that talked to us before, that was identified in her perspective or perception as a major stumbling block, is that when wildlife managers want to proceed with some of the actions that would achieve some of the goals that you described, they run up against opposition that, no, we don't want you messing with our wildlife populations. And whether that comes from the wildlife industry or from First Nations or from other sources, then it seems to be a stopper. Do you see in the period of time that you've been here, do you see or do you hear from your colleagues that social license is changing to allow you to do things like high density harvest of deer in the caribou zones and so on, or reducing populations in the heavily infected areas much more than what CWD might ever do?
It's hard, because I haven't been here that long, but I do have an impression, and I really don't think that things have changed that much based on conversations I've had. I think a lot of it does have to do with openness and transparency and education, and I think if we can do that, then we have a better opportunity with various stakeholder groups to try to achieve some common goals. And maybe when it comes to harvest management, if we had a long-term plan, and we can demonstrate what we're doing and how it's measurable and what we're trying to accomplish, there might be better uptake or support from hunters or other stakeholders for those types of management actions. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement in communication. We are working towards a management plan, so that will be a strategic plan. So rather than having more of an ad hoc approach or changing policies year to year, we have more of a long-term strategy, which hopefully will be accepted by our stakeholders.
Okay, we'll cut the questions off there. You're here for the whole day, I assume. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you missed something or forgot something, you can catch her in the open panel later this afternoon.